Mr. Chairman, if the witness would indulge me, I believe I have just one final question on this matter. The voice, a syrupy Louisiana drawl that seemed more suited to a front porch than the august chambers of the Senate Commerce Committee, belonged to Senator John Kennedy. Immediately, a subtle but undeniable change rippled through the hearing room. The low hum of whispered conversation ceased. The rhythmic clatter of keyboards from the press gallery slowed to a sporadic few taps, then stopped altogether. Anyone with even a passing familiarity with Kennedy's work knew that his version of one final question was akin to a master chef announcing just one final garnish before unveiling a five-course meal of political evisceration. At the witness table, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat poised, a study in calculated confidence. She was dressed in a tailored pantsuit of cobalt blue, a color chosen to project authority and seriousness, a deliberate pivot from the whites and pastels she favored in other settings. Her posture was impeccable, her hands resting calmly on the table before her. Behind her, a phalanx of young, bright-eyed aides stood like a Praetorian guard, their own suits sharp, their folders filled with pre-vetted statistics and talking points. This was supposed to be a routine hearing on technology and consumer protection, a subject where AOC felt she held the high ground, the voice of the digitally native generation against the aging Luddites of the establishment. She offered a small, practiced smile toward the dais, a silent signal of her readiness. "Of course, Senator. I'm here to answer the committee's questions." Kennedy, however, did not immediately look at her. His attention was focused downward, on the formidable stack of documents that sat before him on the polished mahogany. It wasn't a mere sheaf of notes. It was a binder, thick and heavy, its contents meticulously organized with a rainbow of color-coded tabs. He adjusted his reading glasses, his movements slow and unhurried. He was a man with all the time in the world. Across the dais, several of his Republican colleagues, veterans of these beltway battles, subtly shifted in their seats. A faint, knowing smirk flickered across the face of the senior senator from Utah. They had seen this ritual before. The binder, the glasses, the deliberate pause. It was the ceremonial preparation for a public autopsy. Someone's day was about to take a catastrophic turn. In October of 2022, Kennedy began, his tone remaining deceptively casual, almost avuncular. The Congresswoman from New York participated in a panel discussion at the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. "Is that correct?" AOC's confident nod was immediate. "Yes, Senator, that's correct. I was honored to be invited to speak on the future of digital community organizing." Kennedy nodded along as if genuinely interested. The future of digital community, a fascinating topic. And during that panel, the Congresswoman made a statement about the importance of accessibility in technology. She argued, and I believe I have the quote here. He slowly flipped a page in his binder, the crisp sound of the paper echoing in the hushed room. He found the highlighted passage. "Ah, yes. We need to ensure that the tools of the future are not just toys for the rich, but accessible lifelines for the working class." A powerful sentiment, wouldn't you agree? "That's correct, Senator." AOC leaned forward slightly, her voice infused with the passion of a true believer. "The digital divide is one of the most pressing issues of inequality we face. Access to technology is access to opportunity, to education, to healthcare. It is a fundamental right in the 21st century." She was on comfortable ground now, reciting the core tenets of her political philosophy. A fundamental right. Kennedy repeated the phrase slowly, letting it settle in the air. "I couldn't agree more. Now I understand the Congresswoman is a prolific user of social media, a very effective communicator by all accounts. She uses these platforms to connect with her constituents, to get her message out directly to the people. Is that a fair characterization?" "It is, Senator. I believe in meeting people where they are, and today they are on these platforms. It's a form of digital democracy." Digital democracy. Kennedy mused on the words. Excellent. Now, does the Congresswoman recall what device she used to post her messages from that event in Austin? The question was so specific, so seemingly trivial, that it caught everyone off guard. A moment of silence. Not long but perceptible, the kind of pause that signals a sudden internal search for a hidden trap. My phone, Senator. I used my phone. Of course. And what kind of phone does the Congresswoman currently use? AOC's eyes narrowed slightly. The first flicker of unease appeared beneath the placid surface of her confidence. Senator, I fail to see the relevance of my personal cell phone to this hearing. Indulge an old man from Louisiana, Congresswoman. Kennedy's smile was disarmingly polite, yet utterly inflexible. I'm just trying to understand this principle of accessibility. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It's an iPhone. An iPhone. Kennedy's eyebrows raised in feigned delight as if she had just revealed a fascinating clue, a wonderful piece of technology, American innovation at its finest. He flipped another tab in his binder. Now I had my staff do a little research. The model the Congresswoman was photographed with at that event appears to be the iPhone 14 Pro Max, the top-of-the-line model at the time. With the maximum storage capacity, that device retailed for approximately $1,600. He let the number hang in the air. $1,600. The room remained silent. Reporters who had been slouched in their chairs were now sitting bolt upright, their pens poised. Kennedy continued, his voice as smooth as silk. Now, I'm not a tech guru. My grandkids have to help me with the television remote. But I do understand numbers, and I'm having a little trouble squaring the circle here. The Congresswoman gives a passionate speech about making technology accessible for the working class, about the digital divide, while holding a $1,600 device that costs more than a month's rent for many of the families in her own district. He paused, looking directly at her now, his gaze piercing through the television cameras. Does the Congresswoman see how an ordinary person, someone struggling to pay their internet bill, someone using a 5-year-old prepaid phone, might perceive a little bit of a contradiction in that? AOC straightened her back, her expression a careful mask of indignation. Senator, with all due respect, my choice of personal equipment is a distraction. The issue is that millions of Americans cannot afford any smartphone, let alone the one I happen to own. I use the tools available to me to do my job, a job that includes fighting for those very people. It was a well-rehearsed pivot, a classic move from the political playbook. When challenged on a specific, inconvenient fact, broaden the frame to a general, unimpeachable principle. It was a tactic that had served her well in countless cable news hits and Twitter spats. But John Kennedy was not a cable news host, and a Senate hearing room was not Twitter. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't argue the principle. Instead, he gave a slow, thoughtful nod, as if her answer was the most reasonable thing he had ever heard. I understand, he said, his voice still gentle, the tools to do the job, and the representative's job is a very important one. That's why I'm certain the American taxpayer wouldn't mind providing the very best. He let that sink in. Because that is who paid for that phone, isn't it? The taxpayers, through the members' representational allowance. The same working-class people the representative says she's fighting for. They bought their Congresswoman a $1,600 phone. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The attack wasn't just about hypocrisy anymore. It was about the use of public funds. It was a subtle, brilliant escalation. The reporters in the back row began typing furiously. AOC's aides exchanged panicked glances. They had prepared for attacks on policy, on ideology, on her voting record. They had not prepared for a forensic accounting of her office supply purchases. To truly comprehend the devastating precision of that moment, to understand why this seemingly minor exchange was so profoundly dangerous for its target, one must first understand John Neely Kennedy. On the surface, he is a caricature, a walking collection of Southern folksyisms. He speaks of being as confused as a goat on astroturf, and describes nonsensical ideas as being dead as a doornail. The slow, honeyed drawl is his trademark, a vocal performance that suggests a man more comfortable on a fishing boat in the bayou than in the corridors of power. It is an act of political genius, a carefully constructed camouflage that has led countless opponents to fatally underestimate the man sitting across from them. For behind the country lawyer persona lies one of the most formidable intellects in the United States Senate. This is not a man who stumbled into Washington by accident. He is a graduate of Vanderbilt, the University of Virginia School of Law, and most tellingly, Magdalen College, Oxford, where he graduated with first-class honors. He was not a gentleman C student. He was an academic star. Before entering politics, he was a partner at a major law firm. Before becoming a senator, he served for 17 years as the state treasurer of Louisiana. 17 years not as a legislator but as an auditor. 17 years spent poring over balance sheets, investigating bond ratings and following the money. He is, by trade and by temperament, a man who reads the receipts. His colleagues, both friend and foe, have long understood this. They have watched him for years, in hearing after hearing, employ the same methodical, relentless technique. It has become known among Hill staffers as the Kennedy treatment. It begins not with shouting or moral outrage, but with a quiet and meticulous accumulation of facts. His team spends weeks, sometimes months, preparing for a high-profile hearing. They are not digging for salacious rumors or opposition research dirt. They are combing through public records, expense reports, property deeds, campaign finance filings, corporate disclosures, and most importantly, the target's own public statements. Every tweet, every interview, every panel discussion is transcribed, cataloged, and cross-referenced. The result is the binder, the thick, tabbed, almost mythical binder that he brings to every significant confrontation. It is his weapon, and it is filled not with talking points but with evidence. Each tab represents a line of questioning, each highlighted page a verifiable fact. The goal of the Kennedy treatment is not to win a shouting match. It is to construct a prison of logic, brick by factual brick, around his witness until they are left with no room to maneuver, no space for spin, no option but to either admit the contradiction or be exposed by it. His tone is a crucial part of the strategy. He never raises his voice. He is unfailingly polite, addressing witnesses as ma'am or sir. This calm, almost gentle demeanor serves two purposes. First, it makes him appear reasonable and non-threatening, lulling his target into a false sense of security. Second, and more importantly, it makes it impossible for the target to claim victimhood. It is difficult to portray yourself as being viciously attacked when your inquisitor is speaking with the placid cadence of a Sunday school teacher. The politeness is a velvet glove, but it covers an iron fist of pure, unassailable data. He doesn't question their motives, he questions their math. He doesn't attack their beliefs, he presents their bank statements. He transforms a political debate into a public audit, a battleground where slogans and rhetoric are useless against the cold, hard reality of a canceled check. This is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was now beginning to understand. She had walked into the hearing room prepared for a fight over ideology. She was an expert in that arena, a master of framing complex issues in stark, moral terms of good versus evil, justice versus oppression. But Kennedy had refused to engage on that field. He had dragged the conflict onto his own turf, the unforgiving terrain of the spreadsheet. He wasn't arguing about whether the digital divide was real. He was asking what she paid for her phone. And in doing so, he was subtly reframing the entire narrative, not as a champion of the poor versus the forces of corporate greed, but as a privileged politician enjoying luxury goods purchased with taxpayer money while preaching austerity for everyone else. It was a brutally effective maneuver, and the silence from her side of the table was proof of its success. To appreciate the full essence of Kennedy's strategy, one must also understand the unique political phenomenon that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her ascent was nothing short of meteoric, a political fairy tale for the modern, social media-driven age. In 2018, she was a bartender and a community organizer, a relative unknown even within the activist circles of New York City. Less than a year later, she was one of the most famous and influential politicians in the world. She didn't just win an election, she detonated a bomb under the foundations of the Democratic establishment. Her primary victory over Joe Crowley, a 10-term incumbent and the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House, was a political earthquake. It announced the arrival of a new generation of leadership, one that was young, diverse, unapologetically progressive, and digitally fluent. Her brand was built on a foundation of authenticity. She was AOC, the girl from the Bronx, the working-class hero who had personally experienced the struggles she now fought to overcome. She spoke openly about her family's financial hardships, about working service jobs, about the crushing weight of student loan debt. This wasn't a focus-grouped backstory. It felt real, visceral. She wasn't a creature of Washington. She was an invader, sent to burn down the corrupt and complacent old order. Her supporters saw in her a reflection of their own anxieties and aspirations. Her communication style was her superpower. Where traditional politicians spoke in carefully parsed, poll-tested platitudes, AOC was a flamethrower. She was direct, passionate, and often confrontational. She leveraged platforms like Twitter and Instagram with a mastery that left her older colleagues bewildered. She didn't just issue press releases. She hosted Instagram live sessions from her kitchen while making macaroni and cheese, breaking down complex policy issues in a casual, accessible way. She created memes, clapped back at critics with savage wit, and gave her millions of followers a behind-the-scenes look at the workings of Congress. She wasn't just a legislator. She was a content creator, a political influencer who understood that in the 21st century, attention is the most valuable currency. This approach was wildly successful. She became the de facto leader of the Squad, a group of progressive congresswomen of color who challenged the party's moderate consensus. She drove the national conversation on issues like the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, pulling the entire Democratic Party to the left. The media was captivated by her. Magazine covers, glowing profiles, and late-night talk show appearances followed. She was a cultural icon as much as a political one, a symbol of a new, more radical future. But with this rapid rise to fame came a unique vulnerability. Her entire political identity was built on the premise of being an outsider, an authentic voice of the people fighting against the privileged elite. This created a perilous gap between her image and the reality of her new life. As a member of Congress, she was now part of the very establishment she railed against. She earned a salary of $174,000 a year, placing her in the top echelon of American earners. She was granted access to the exclusive corridors of power, attending galas and rubbing elbows with the very CEOs and billionaires she denounced online. This inherent contradiction became the central target for her opponents. They began meticulously documenting every instance where her lifestyle seemed to diverge from her working-class rhetoric. There was the expensive apartment in a luxury building in Washington, D.C.'s Navy Yard. There were the high-fashion outfits featured in magazine photo shoots. There was the infamous Tax the Rich dress worn to the Met Gala, an event with a $35,000 ticket price. Each of these incidents, taken in isolation, could be explained away as a necessary part of the job or a strategic use of her platform. But taken together, they began to form a pattern, a narrative of hypocrisy that her critics relentlessly promoted. This was the vulnerability that John Kennedy was now so expertly exploiting. He wasn't attacking her for being a socialist or for her policy positions. He understood that such attacks would only energize her base. Instead, he was executing a far more subtle and insidious strategy. He was holding up a mirror, reflecting her own words and actions back at her, and quietly asking if the two images matched. The question about the iPhone was a microcosm of this entire approach. It wasn't about the phone itself. It was about the symbolism. It was about a politician who built a brand on the idea of shared struggle while enjoying the perks of elite status, paid for by the very people she claimed to represent. AOC, for her part, seemed to sense the danger, but her usual defenses were proving ineffective. She tried to pivot back to policy. "Senator, if you are truly concerned about the cost of technology for working families, perhaps we could discuss legislation to regulate the industry and ensure fair pricing." It was a good line, a solid attempt to regain control of the narrative. Kennedy simply smiled. "A fine idea, Congresswoman, a very fine idea, and I look forward to discussing that at the appropriate time. But right now, I'm just trying to understand the taxpayer-funded purchasing decisions of your office." He flipped to another tab in his binder, the gesture slow and deliberate. "Now, let's talk about the software subscriptions on this phone." The trap was closing. Every denial, every deflection, only seemed to dig her deeper. She had built her career on the power of her personal story, on the seamless fusion of her identity and her politics. Now, John Kennedy was using that very fusion against her, not with insults or ideology, but with a quiet, methodical, and utterly devastating presentation of the receipts. The hearing room was no longer just a forum for debate. It had become a stage for a slow, meticulous deconstruction of a political brand, and the audience, both in the room and watching at home, could not look away. Software subscriptions. The phrase, so mundane and bureaucratic, landed in the silent hearing room with the force of a judge's gavel. Kennedy's focus was entirely on his binder now. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers moving with a surgeon's precision to a new tab, this one a bright, almost fluorescent yellow. The rustle of the paper was the only sound. He was in no hurry. The silence was his ally, a vacuum that AOC's defense had failed to fill, and he was letting the pressure build with each passing second. AOC's hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, now clenched slightly. Her knuckles went white. "Senator, my office, like every office in Congress, uses standard software to communicate. This is a baseless fishing expedition." Her voice was tight, a brittle edge creeping into its normally fluid cadence. "Is that so?" Kennedy murmured, not looking up. He extracted a single sheet of paper from behind the yellow tab. It was an expense report, a dense grid of names and numbers, with several lines highlighted in the same garish yellow ink. "Because I have here a publicly available summary of the office expenditures for the representative from New York, and there are a few items I'm curious about. For example, I see a recurring monthly subscription for the full Adobe Creative Cloud suite. That's Photoshop, Premiere Pro, After Effects, very powerful professional-grade software. The cost is about $60 a month. Now I understand a press secretary might need something like that, but I also see subscriptions for apps like Facetune and VSCO Pro." He pronounced the names carefully, as if they were exotic species he was identifying for the first time. "My staff tells me these are high-end photo and video editing applications, used to, how did they put it, enhance one's digital appearance, to add filters, smooth skin, adjust lighting, things of that nature." He finally looked up, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Is enhancing one's digital appearance now an official duty of a member of Congress?" Light, scattered snickers rippled through the Republican side of the dais. The chairman, a Democrat from Michigan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was straying far from the committee's official business, but Kennedy's quiet, methodical delivery made it difficult to interrupt. "Senator, in the 21st century, visual communication is essential," AOC retorted, her face flushing. "My constituents expect to see and hear from me across all platforms. These are tools to facilitate that communication effectively. It is no different than paying a firm to print newsletters in the 1980s. An interesting comparison. Kennedy set the expense report down. "So, let's talk about communication. Let me ask the representative, who was the intended audience for these enhanced, professionally edited photos and videos. My constituents, the American people, anyone who wants to be informed." The answer was automatic, a line from 1,000 stump speeches. "Oh, I see, but I do." Kennedy lifted another sheet of paper. This one was a printout from a social media analytics firm, because according to this data, over 60% of the representative's online engagement comes from outside her congressional district, 40% from outside the state of New York. In fact, the representative has more followers in California than in the Bronx. He paused. "So when the representative uses taxpayer funds to purchase software to create content, she's not primarily communicating with the people who elected her and paid for that software. She's communicating with a national and even international audience. She's building a national brand." AOC bit her lip. "Senator, my responsibility is to my district, but my voice has an impact on the national debate. I won't apologize for that. I'm not asking for an apology, Congresswoman. I am once again just trying to establish the facts." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more pointed. "The fact is, a $1,600 phone was purchased with taxpayer money. That phone was then loaded with expensive, professional-grade software, also purchased with taxpayer money. That software was then used to create polished, enhanced content that primarily serves a national audience, building the representative's personal brand as a political influencer. And all of this was done under the banner of fighting for the working class and bridging the digital divide. He let the summary hang in the air, a closing argument in miniature. The chairman cleared his throat, looking at the clock. "Senator Kennedy, if you could please move toward your final question." "I'm almost there, Mr. Chairman," Kennedy said, his gaze never leaving AOC. "Because I agree with the Congresswoman. The digital divide is a serious issue. She's a powerful voice on the subject. So my question is this. Since that speech in Austin over a year ago, how many pieces of legislation has the representative from New York introduced and successfully passed into law to directly address this digital divide? How many bills to provide affordable broadband to her constituents? How many programs to get low-cost devices into the hands of working families in her district?" The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, colder. This was no longer about phones or software. This was about results. AOC opened her mouth, then closed it. The names of bills she had co-sponsored, resolutions she had supported, were on the tip of her tongue. But she knew that wasn't the question. The question was about bills passed into law. The question was about tangible accomplishments. "I'll help the representative," Kennedy said, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "The answer is zero. Zero bills passed into law." But he continued, flipping a final page. "My staff did find this. The representative has posted on Twitter about the digital divide 312 times. She has created 74 Instagram stories on the topic. She mentioned it in 13 cable news appearances and 4 podcast interviews. Lots of communication, lots of content, lots of brand building." He looked up from his papers, his eyes locking with hers. "But as for actual relief for the people in her district, as for closing the gap she so passionately talks about," he gestured to the empty space in front of him, "I'm just not seeing it. The receipts aren't there." AOC's face was a pale, rigid mask. "Senator, the Congresswoman from Louisiana knows full well that a single member of the House cannot pass legislation alone. It requires a movement. It requires authenticity," Kennedy interjected. And for the first time the folksy drawl was gone, replaced by a blade of steel. "That's what this is about, Congresswoman. Because when the people in your district, people who can't afford their internet bill, see their representative using a $1,600 phone paid for by their taxes to tweet about their problems, one of two things happens. Either they conclude their representative is a hypocrite, or they conclude their representative thinks they're too stupid to notice. And for the life of me, I can't figure out which is worse." The tension in the hearing room was now a physical presence, thick and suffocating. The chairman tapped his gavel weakly, a sound absorbed and nullified by the charged atmosphere. "Senator Kennedy, your time has expired." But Kennedy seemed not to hear him. He was already moving on, flipping to a new section of his binder, this one marked with a stark, blood-red tab. "Now let me move to another example of this disconnect," he continued, the word chosen with surgical care. "What does the representative currently drive when she is in Washington, D.C.? AOC blinked, blindsided by the abrupt shift in topic. The question seemed to come from another universe. "Senator, my personal vehicle has absolutely no bearing on the issue of consumer protection." "Just humor me, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his polite smile back in place, but his eyes were cold, unyielding. "What kind of car does the representative use to get around the Capitol?" I have a Tesla." The admission was reluctant, forced. "A Tesla?" Kennedy nodded, his expression one of pure, unadulterated approval, as if she had just announced a major breakthrough in peace negotiations. "An electric vehicle. A wonderful choice. Good for the planet. A shining example of the Green New Deal the representative has so powerfully championed, correct?" "That's correct, Senator. Climate change is the single greatest threat facing our generation." The answer was a reflex, a pre-programmed response to a familiar keyword. "Absolutely," Kennedy agreed heartily. "Couldn't agree more. Protecting our environment is a sacred duty. But I'm just a curious fellow. What model Tesla does the representative own?" AOC hesitated again. She could feel the jaws of the trap slowly closing, but she could see no path of escape. It's a Model S. Model S. Kennedy savored the name. The flagship model, I believe. The long-range performance version. He flipped another page in his ever-present binder. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, so I'm not an expert on these things. But according to my research, the base price for a Tesla Model S at the time the representative acquired hers was just shy of $100,000. But of course, one gets the upgrades. The premium connectivity, the enhanced autopilot, the 21-inch arachnid wheels. He read the options off the page with a connoisseur's appreciation. The final sticker price was likely closer to $130,000. Is that in the ballpark? I don't recall the exact price, Senator. It was a lease. Ah, a lease, of course. Much more sensible. Kennedy nodded sagely. Still, the monthly payments on a vehicle of that value, they're not insignificant. He folded his hands on the table, his demeanor shifting from curious questioner to concerned financial advisor. And here's where my confusion comes in again. The representative's message is one of solidarity with the working poor, with people who are struggling to put gas in their 20-year-old Honda Civic. The median household income in the representative's own district, the 14th of New York, is around $67,000 a year. That's for a whole family. And the representative is driving a car that costs nearly double what her average constituent's entire family makes in a year. He let the comparison settle, the silence stretching uncomfortably. He then continued, his voice soft. Now there are other EVs, good ones. The Chevy Bolt, for example. You can get one of those for about $25,000. The Nissan Leaf, even less. American-made, union-built cars. But the representative chose a Tesla, a luxury status symbol, the preferred vehicle of Silicon Valley billionaires and Hollywood celebrities. My question, Congresswoman, is how do you explain to a family in the Bronx, a family riding the bus because they can't afford a car at all, that you understand their struggle when you're driving a six-figure luxury sedan? AOC's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped along her cheek. Senator, I need a reliable and safe vehicle to perform my duties. I travel extensively, and I chose an electric vehicle to align with my commitment to a fossil fuel-free future. Commitment? Kennedy seized the word. That's a powerful word, because a commitment means you live your values, doesn't it? And the representative's stated values are a rejection of lavish consumption, a critique of the wealthy flaunting their status. But when it comes time for the representative to choose her own mode of transport, he shrugged, a simple gesture that conveyed a world of meaning. It seems the revolutionary spirit doesn't extend to the parking garage. That is an outrageous and unfair characterization. AOC began, her voice rising for the first time. But Kennedy was already moving on, a predator sensing weakness and pressing the attack. And speaking of lifestyle, let me ask, where does the representative reside when she is in Washington? The question hung in the air, a clear and present danger. This was territory she desperately wanted to avoid. I have an apartment. An apartment, yes. In what neighborhood? Kennedy pressed gently. The Navy Yard. The answer was barely a whisper. The Navy Yard. Kennedy repeated the name with the same feigned enthusiasm he'd used for the Tesla. A beautiful part of the city. One of the newest, most vibrant and most expensive neighborhoods in the District of Columbia. Full of luxury high-rises, rooftop pools, five-star restaurants. Prime real estate. He opened another folder, this one marked with a green tab. In fact, I took the liberty of looking at public records for the building the representative has listed as her address. A stunning place. Doorman, state-of-the-art gym, concierge service. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in that building, and I'm talking about a standard unit, not one of the penthouses, is approximately $4,200 a month. He looked up from his papers. Now, a member of Congress is paid a salary of $174,000. That's a good living, no one is denying that. But after federal and state taxes, after maintaining a second residence back in the district, after paying off those student loans the representative has spoken so eloquently about, that $4,000 a month rent, it's a significant portion of one's take-home pay. He leaned back, the picture of thoughtful concern. But here's what I find admirable. Many younger members of Congress, members who don't come from wealth, they find ways to be frugal. They share apartments. They rent rooms in group houses. There was a famous group of Republican congressmen a few years back who all lived together in a townhouse, sleeping on cots, to save money and send a message about fiscal discipline. He paused, his eyes twinkling. The representative doesn't have a roommate, does she? I require a secure and private space to conduct my work, AOC said, her voice strained. Privacy? Of course. Very important. Kennedy nodded. But the representative must understand how a constituent of hers, someone sharing a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Queens with 3 other people to make rent, might feel a little disconnected when they hear their champion of the working class is living alone in a luxury apartment with a concierge. The picture is becoming clearer now, isn't it? The $1,600 phone, the $130,000 car, the $4,000 a month apartment. It all starts to add up, and it adds up to a lifestyle that is profoundly detached from the people the representative claims to represent. Silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. AOC staff behind her looked ashen. They were witnessing a masterclass in political vivisection, and their principal was the one on the table. Every word Kennedy spoke was a careful, precise incision, laying bare the nerve of the contradiction at the heart of her political identity. Media Gallery, once a place of detached observation, had transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Reporters who had been half listening were now hunched over their laptops, fingers flying across keyboards, crafting headlines in real time. Producers in the back row were speaking urgently into their phones, their voices hushed but intense. Get me a clip of the Tesla exchange. We need a graphic with the apartment rent versus the district income. Is this live on C-SPAN? Patch it through now. They all recognized the scent of political blood in the water. This wasn't just another dry committee hearing. This was a defining political moment, a viral event in the making. Kennedy's questioning was perfectly engineered for the modern media ecosystem. Each line of inquiry was a self-contained, easily digestible segment, ideal for a 2-minute cable news clip or a 60-second TikTok video. The iPhone, the Tesla, the luxury apartment. They were simple, relatable symbols that cut through the noise of complex policy debates. You didn't need a degree in economics to understand the apparent contradiction of someone decrying wealth inequality from a 6-figure electric car. The optics were brutal, and Kennedy was serving them up on a silver platter. Even before the hearing had concluded, the first wave of stories began to hit the internet. Conservative outlets, naturally, were jubilant. Breitbart's headline screamed, "Kennedy exposes AOC's champagne socialist lifestyle with her own receipts." The Daily Wire was more direct. AOC grilled over taxpayer-funded luxury life. Fox News immediately booked a panel of commentators to dissect the epic takedown. But what was more telling, and far more dangerous for Ocasio-Cortez, was the reaction from the mainstream and even left-leaning press. They couldn't ignore it. The facts Kennedy presented were all matters of public record. His tone had been civil, almost scholarly. This wasn't a wild, unsubstantiated rant from a partisan extremist. It was a methodical, evidence-based cross-examination. CNN's on-screen chyron read, "Contentious hearing. Kennedy questions Ocasio-Cortez on spending." The New York Times' initial online report was cautiously worded, but acknowledged the core of the conflict. Senator Kennedy pressed Representative Ocasio-Cortez on a series of personal expenditures, creating an uncomfortable contrast with her populist political messaging. Online, the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The clips, professionally edited and packaged by Republican PACs within minutes, spread like wildfire across Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. The hashtag AOC receipts began to trend. For her supporters, it was a vicious, bad faith attack, a smear campaign designed to distract from the real issues. They flooded social media with messages of support, decrying Kennedy's tactics as sexist, classist, and a desperate attempt by the old guard to silence a powerful progressive voice. They argued that it was perfectly reasonable for a congresswoman to have a reliable car and a secure apartment, and that focusing on these trivialities was a classic right-wing deflection. But for a much larger, less ideologically committed swath of the public, The exchange was deeply damaging. It tapped into a potent and widespread cynicism about politicians of all stripes, the feeling that they say one thing to get elected and then live by a completely different set of rules. Kennedy's questions didn't need to prove that AOC was a bad person. They only needed to plant a seed of doubt about her authenticity. And for a politician whose entire brand was built on authenticity, that seed of doubt was poison. The comment sections of news articles and social media posts became a battleground. So she tells us to ride the bus while she drives a Tesla. Got it. My rent in the Bronx is $2,200 for a one-bedroom and I have to fight off rats. Must be nice to have a concierge. I don't care if she's a Democrat or a Republican, that's just hypocritical. Mixed in with these were the defenders. So she's not allowed to be successful. This is just another attempt to tear down a powerful woman. At least she's fighting for us. What has Kennedy ever done for the poor? But the damage was in the very nature of the debate. She was now forced to defend her personal lifestyle choices, a defensive crouch from which it is almost impossible to project strength or leadership. The conversation was no longer about the Green New Deal or income inequality. It was about the price of her car. Kennedy had successfully changed the subject. And in politics, the person who controls the subject of the conversation controls the battle. Inside the hearing room, the weight of this public reaction seemed to press down on Ocasio-Cortez. She was a master of the digital realm. She knew exactly how this was playing out beyond the chamber walls. She could likely feel her phone buzzing in her pocket with frantic texts from her communications director. Her face, which had cycled through confidence, annoyance, and anger, now seemed to settle into a kind of weary resignation. She was a fighter, a political brawler who had never shied away from a confrontation. But how do you fight a spreadsheet? How do you brawl with a lease agreement? Kennedy, meanwhile, appeared entirely unperturbed by the storm he had unleashed. He remained a picture of calm, his demeanor unchanged. He was not grandstanding for the cameras or playing to the crowd. He was simply continuing his work, moving to the next tab in his binder, the next piece of evidence in his meticulously constructed case. He understood something fundamental about political combat. Outrage is a fleeting emotion, but a documented fact is a permanent stain. He wasn't aiming for a knockout blow in the first round. He was a body puncher, patiently and methodically wearing down his opponent, one verifiable, uncomfortable, and publicly recorded fact at a time. The media frenzy was not the goal. It was merely a byproduct of a strategy that was far more patient and far more lethal. Senator, I resent the implication, AOC began, her voice shaking with a fury she could no longer contain. Kennedy interrupted, and for the very first time the gentle, avuncular tone vanished, replaced by a voice as cold and hard as a marble slab. I am not implying anything, Congresswoman. I am stating facts. Facts about the choices the representative has made. Facts about the chasm between the representative's rhetoric and the representative's reality. And I am asking the representative, on behalf of the American people, to reconcile them. The chairman, a moderate Democrat who clearly wished he were anywhere else on earth, made another attempt to intervene. Senator Kennedy, the committee has other witnesses. Just one more area, Mr. Chairman, Kennedy said, cutting him off without a glance. His eyes were locked on Ocasio-Cortez. He flipped to a new section in the binder. This one was thicker than the others, its tab a somber shade of gray. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. It was no longer prosecutorial. It was quiet, almost mournful. Congresswoman, in August of 2021, the representative was a vocal and passionate advocate for the extension of the federal eviction moratorium. Is that correct? AOC's expression shifted instantly. This was a subject she had not anticipated, but it was one where she felt she stood on solid moral ground. A flicker of her old confidence returned. Yes, Senator. Absolutely. Millions of Americans were on the brink of homelessness due to the pandemic. Extending that moratorium was a moral imperative. I was proud to protest on the steps of the Capitol to ensure families were not thrown onto the street. Proud to protest. Kennedy nodded slowly. I remember. It was a powerful moment, widely covered. The representative was praised for her activism, for literally putting her body on the line for her constituents. He pulled a sheet from the gray section. It was a collection of news clippings, photos of AOC with a megaphone, sitting on the Capitol steps, her face a portrait of righteous determination. And during that time, Kennedy continued, his voice steady. The representative tweeted extensively about the issue. She spoke of greedy landlords and predatory corporations putting profits before people. Let me see if I have the exact quote. He adjusted his glasses. Ah, here it is. August 2nd, 2021. Housing is a human right. Landlords are not entitled to profit off of human misery. Does the representative stand by that statement? 100%, Senator. Housing is a fundamental right. The response was firm, unwavering. Good, I'm glad to hear it. Kennedy set the clippings down. Now, Congresswoman, I have a simple question, and I would ask you to consider your answer very carefully. Does the representative, or any business entity with which she is associated, currently own any residential rental properties? It was a thunderclap in a silent room. The question was so unexpected, so far removed from the established lines of attack, that for a moment no one seemed to breathe. The reporters in the back froze, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. AOC's aides, who had been whispering furiously, fell silent, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Ocasio-Cortez herself looked as though she had been physically struck. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Kennedy, then at the chairman, then down at the polished table in front of her. Her confident posture dissolved. My family has some real estate holdings, she stammered, her voice barely audible. Family? Kennedy's voice remained gentle, but it was the gentleness of a python tightening its coils. Yes, I know. I have the public records right here. He lifted a thick document, a property deed from the Bronx County Clerk's office. A limited liability company, Deco Diaz LLC, registered to an address in Parkchester. The listed agent for this LLC is the representative's mother, Blanca Ocasio-Cortez. And this LLC is the owner of a multi-family residential property in the Bronx. He looked up. Is the representative familiar with this company and this property? It's a small building. It's been in my family. It's not a major corporation. Her words were tumbling out, disorganized, panicked. I never said it was. But it is a rental property, is it not, with tenants who pay rent? Yes, the admission was a whisper of surrender. And this property, Kennedy said, his eyes returning to the documents, has, according to New York City court records, filed for the eviction of 4 separate tenants since June of 2021. 4 families. During the very period the representative was protesting on the Capitol steps to stop evictions. During the very months the representative was tweeting about greedy landlords profiting from human misery. The room was now so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The weight of the revelation was crushing. This wasn't about a phone or a car anymore. This wasn't about lifestyle choices. This was about a direct, irreconcilable contradiction between her most passionate public advocacy and her family's private financial dealings. One of those eviction filings, Kennedy continued, his voice a relentless, sorrowful cadence, was against a tenant who was, at the time, $4,000 in arrears, an amount roughly equivalent to the monthly rent on the representative's own luxury apartment in Navy Yard. He let that fact detonate in the silence. He then set the court records down on top of the property deed, creating a small, damning pile of evidence. He looked at AOC, not with triumph, but with something that looked almost like pity. Congresswoman, I am not going to ask you to defend your family. I believe family is off limits. But the representative made housing her signature issue. The representative made landlords the villain in her political narrative. The representative built a national platform on the idea that housing is a human right and profiting from it is immoral. And while she was doing that, the company bearing her family's name was in court, trying to evict her own constituents. He leaned back in his chair, the squeak of the leather loud in the stillness. So I will ask my question again, and I hope the American people get an honest answer. Was this really about a deeply held principle, or was this about politics? Because if it was the former, then surely that principle would apply to your own backyard. But if it was the latter, if this was all just a performance, he let the sentence hang, unfinished but understood. Well, that's a hypocrisy so profound, so staggering, that it calls into question everything the representative claims to stand for. AOC sat motionless, her face ashen. There was no defense. There was no pivot. There was no way to reframe the raw, ugly facts. She had been a warrior, a champion, a voice for the voiceless. And in the space of 5 minutes, John Kennedy, with his quiet voice and his meticulously organized binder, had recast her as just another landlord. The silence that followed was the sound of a political identity shattering. AOC's face was now a canvas of stunned disbelief. Her mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air, but the practiced, rapid-fire responses that had defined her career failed to materialize. The attack was too personal, too fundamental. It wasn't a critique of her policy. It was an indictment of her soul. My family's finances, that's private. The words were a fragile shield against a hurricane. The representative made it public, Kennedy said, his voice devoid of malice but firm with an unshakable logic. The representative chose to make the morality of landlords a central theme of her public identity. The representative used the power of her office to condemn an entire class of people. The representative can't now claim that her own family's participation in that very business is a private matter, shielded from scrutiny. That's not how accountability works. He straightened the pile of deeds and court filings into a neat, rectangular stack. The gesture was deliberate, a visual cue that he was closing one chapter of his argument and preparing to begin another. The chairman, sensing an opportunity to finally end the proceeding, leaned into his microphone. "Senator Kennedy, I believe the witness has answered. Perhaps we can." "One more line of questioning, Mr. Chairman," Kennedy said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "because we must talk about policy. We have discussed personal choices, lifestyle, and the glaring gap between words and deeds. But ultimately, the people of the 14th District of New York elected a legislator, not a social media influencer. They expect results. So let's talk about the Green New Deal." The shift was jarring, but for AOC, it was a potential lifeline. This was her signature issue, the policy that had made her a national figure. She had debated its merits 1,000 times. Her posture straightened slightly. The blood began to return to her face. "I would be happy to discuss the Green New Deal, Senator." "Excellent." Kennedy opened the thickest section of his binder, a tome within a tome, bristling with tabs of every shade of green. A sweeping, ambitious resolution the representative introduced in 2019. A plan to remake our entire economy to combat climate change and economic injustice. I've read it several times, and I had my staff, along with some very smart people at nonpartisan think tanks, run the numbers. He looked up, peering at her over the rim of his glasses. "Now, according to a median estimate, not the highest or the lowest, the total cost to implement the Green New Deal as written would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $90 trillion. $90 trillion. Is the representative familiar with that figure? That's a bad faith estimate from right-wing organizations funded by the fossil fuel industry." AOC shot back, the familiar rhythm of debate returning to her. "Perhaps," Kennedy conceded with a magnanimous wave of his hand. "It's always wise to be skeptical, so let's ignore them. Let's use the numbers from a study by a very progressive economist, someone the representative has quoted favorably in the past. His estimate was lower, only $50 trillion, so let's be generous. Let's use that number, $50 trillion over 10 years. He let the figure settle in the room. "Now, does the representative know how much the entire federal budget is for 1 year? "I don't have the exact number in front of me. "About $6 trillion, Kennedy supplied. "So the representative's plan would cost, on average, $5 trillion a year. That's nearly the entire current federal budget every year for a decade, on top of what we already spend." He leaned back. "So I have a very simple, non-ideological question, Congresswoman. How do you pay for it?" AOC straightened, on comfortable ground now. "Senator, as the plan clearly states, it would be paid for through a combination of progressive taxation, carbon taxes, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and the economic stimulus created by the program itself." "Progressive taxation." Kennedy nodded. "An excellent idea. Let's tax the rich, I'm all for it. So let's do the math. The total combined net worth of every billionaire in America is roughly $4.5 trillion. If you were to pass a law tomorrow to confiscate 100% of their wealth, every stock, every bond, every piece of real estate, every yacht, you would raise $4.5 trillion. One time. And that would not even pay for the first year of the representative's plan. And then, of course, there would be no more billionaires to tax. He continued, his voice the patient cadence of a math tutor. So okay, let's expand our definition. Let's go after the millionaires too. Let's say we take half of everything from every person with a net worth over $1 million. That might get you another 10 or 12 trillion. Again, one time. You're still not even close to 50 trillion. The numbers just don't add up. The costs would be offset by the benefits, AOC argued. Preventing climate catastrophes, creating millions of high-paying jobs. Of course, but you have to pay the upfront cost first. And the reality, the simple, unavoidable arithmetic is that the only way to raise that kind of capital is with massive, broad-based taxes on everyone. That means the middle class. That means the working class. There is no other way. The math does not allow for another way. And when the representative goes back to her district, to the families making $60,000 a year, and tells them that their taxes have to double to pay for this plan, does she truly believe they will thank her for her vision? But let's set aside the cost for a moment, Kennedy said, already moving on before she could formulate a response. Let's talk about what was actually in the plan. Does the representative recall the original FAQ document her office released along with the resolution? A document that was posted on her official congressional website. AOC's expression tightened. This was a minefield and she knew it. That document, Kennedy said, pulling out yet another paper, this one looking worn, as if it had been handled many times, contained a rather remarkable promise. It guaranteed economic security for all who are unable or unwilling to work. He enunciated each word with deliberate clarity. Unwilling to work. Does the representative remember that particular phrase? That was a drafting error by a staffer, AOC said quickly. It was removed and corrected. A drafting error. Kennedy repeated the phrase, a marveling tone in his voice. An error that somehow made it through the entire drafting process, through supervisory review, and onto an official United States government website, where it remained for nearly 2 full days before it was taken down, and only then after a firestorm of public criticism. He shook his head slowly. Congresswoman, in my experience, a typo is when you accidentally hit the wrong key. A multi-word phrase that fundamentally alters the nature of a multi-trillion-dollar policy proposal isn't a typo. It's a statement of intent. It reveals the true ideological underpinnings of the plan. And the fact that it was only removed after a public backlash is, frankly, even more disturbing. It suggests the representatives' team didn't see anything wrong with it until the polls told them it was a problem. The hearing was no longer a cross-examination. It had become a demolition. Kennedy was not just attacking her policies. He was dismantling the very foundation of her competence, suggesting that her signature legislative achievement was not just financially impossible, but ideologically incoherent and sloppily executed. Each question was another blow from a sledgehammer, and the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. We clarified our position, AOC insisted, her voice tight with frustration. The final resolution does not contain that language. After public outcry, Kennedy emphasized, his voice cutting through her defense. Not before. The representative only corrected the course after the ship had already struck the iceberg. And that raises a terrifying question, Congresswoman. What other drafting errors are lurking within this $90 trillion proposal? What other unintended consequences have the representative and her staff failed to consider in their revolutionary zeal? He flipped more pages, the sound a percussive beat marking the relentless pace of his assault. Let's talk about a consequence that isn't hypothetical. Let's talk about jobs. Real jobs for real people in the representative's own district. In 2019, Amazon, one of the largest employers in the world, announced its intention to build a massive new headquarters, HQ2, in Long Island City, Queens, right in the representative's backyard. The project promised 25,000 jobs, with an average salary of over $150,000 a year. Not to mention the thousands of construction jobs, the ripple effect for local small businesses, the billions in new tax revenue for the city. He looked up, his face a mask of sincere puzzlement. And what was the representative's response to this unprecedented economic opportunity for her constituents? My response was to stand with my community against a backroom deal that gave billions in corporate welfare to one of the richest companies on earth. AOC's voice rang with renewed conviction. This was a fight she had won, a moment she viewed as a triumph. The representative led the charge to kill the deal, Kennedy stated, rephrasing her victory as a destructive act. The representative celebrated when Amazon announced it was pulling out. I remember the tweet. Anything is possible. Today was the day a group of dedicated, everyday New Yorkers and their neighbors defeated Amazon's corporate greed. The representative declared it a great victory. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A victory for whom, Congresswoman? Was it a victory for the 25,000 families that would have had those high-paying jobs? Was it a victory for the local bodegas and restaurants that would have served those workers? Was it a victory for the city that lost out on an estimated $27 billion in tax revenue? The representative killed 25,000 jobs and called it a win. Those jobs were a Trojan horse for gentrification and displacement, and they came at the cost of $3 billion in public subsidies. Let's examine that, Kennedy said, clearly anticipating this exact argument. He pulled a new document from his binder, a single-page summary prepared by the nonpartisan New York City Comptroller's Office. The tax incentives were approximately $3 billion. That is correct. In exchange for that $3 billion investment, the city and state were projected to receive $27 billion in new tax revenue over the next decade. He tapped the paper with his finger. $27 billion. That is a 9-to-1 return on investment. $9 in revenue for every $1 in tax breaks. And that doesn't even begin to calculate the indirect economic benefits. He looked at her, his expression one of profound disappointment. I'm just a country boy from Louisiana, Congresswoman, but where I come from, if you can invest $1 and get $9 back, you take that deal every single time. But the representative chose ideology over arithmetic. Kennedy spread several charts and maps across the table in front of him. But since the representative seems to prefer moral victories to economic ones, let me show you the real-world consequences of her choice. This is a map of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Here is the representative's district, and here are the neighboring districts in Queens and Brooklyn. Since 2019, the year Amazon pulled out, these neighboring areas have seen robust job growth, wage increases, and new business formation. The representative's district has stagnated. Unemployment in the 14th district remains stubbornly higher than in the areas around it. Household income growth is slower. Small business creation is lagging. He pushed a chart toward her. Every single metric, Congresswoman, every objective measure shows that the community you represent is falling behind its neighbors. And the single biggest variable, the single biggest difference, is that those other communities welcomed investment and you blocked it. He gathered the charts, his movements crisp and efficient. The representative's progressive purity test cost her own constituents tangible, life-changing opportunities. But the representative got to claim a scalp. The representative got headlines in The Guardian and a glowing profile on MSNBC. The representative's national brand as a giant killer was secured. And the people of her district, he shrugged. They got to keep their ideological purity. I'm sure that pays the rent. AOC's face was flushed with anger. You are deliberately misrepresenting my record. I have fought for and secured millions in federal funding for my district. I have no doubt the representative has fought hard, Kennedy conceded. But the numbers don't lie. And it is a pattern, is it not? Not just Amazon. Look at the record. Opposition to new housing developments because they aren't 100% affordable. Opposition to new business improvement districts because they represent corporate interests. Every opportunity for partnership, every chance for pragmatic growth, is rejected if it fails to meet some impossible standard of ideological perfection. And the result? Stagnation. But the representative's fundraising numbers are excellent. Her Twitter following continues to grow. The representative herself is doing just fine. Her community, however, is paying the price for her celebrity. He leaned back, his voice taking on a weary, philosophical tone. Congresswoman, I represent a poor state. We've got our share of problems in Louisiana, but I can tell you this. When a company wants to build a new plant and create 500 jobs in my state, I don't hand them a list of ideological demands and then show them the door when they can't meet every single one. I roll up my sleeves and I get the best possible deal for my people. Because I was elected to deliver results, not to strike a pose. The representative was elected to improve the lives of her constituents, and based on every objective measure, she has failed to do so. In fact, she has actively worked against their economic interests and then called it a victory. And that, Congresswoman, is not just a policy failure. It is a betrayal. Betrayal. The word landed with the finality of a coffin lid closing. It hung in the air, echoing in the profound silence that followed. It was no longer a debate about policy or a critique of lifestyle. It was a moral judgment, delivered with the quiet, devastating force of a sermon. Kennedy began to gather his papers, not in a rush, but with the methodical care of a craftsman putting away his tools. He stacked the charts, aligned the edges of the property deeds, and closed the enormous binder. The series of soft, rustling sounds was the only motion in the room. He had said all he needed to say. The case was made. The evidence was presented. He was done. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its prosecutorial edge. The Louisiana drawl had returned, softer now, imbued with an almost melancholy quality. Congresswoman, I don't doubt for a second that you are sincere. I believe you genuinely want to help people. I believe you care deeply about the issues of poverty and injustice. Good intentions are a fine thing, but in this town they are not enough. Intentions don't pave roads. Sincerity doesn't create jobs. Passion doesn't pay a family's mortgage. Results are the only thing that matters. Real, tangible, measurable results. And the hard truth, the truth that is borne out by the facts I have presented here today, is that the representative's approach has produced rhetoric, not results. It has produced celebrity, not solutions. It has produced division, not development. He picked up a final piece of paper. This is a recent poll conducted by a well-respected, nonpartisan firm of registered voters in your own district. Residents were asked a simple question. Do you believe your representative is more focused on her national profile or on the needs of the local community? He set the paper down gently on the table, facing her. 62%, Congresswoman. 62% of your own constituents believe you are more focused on being a national celebrity than on being their local representative. Those aren't Republicans saying that. Those aren't right-wing trolls. Those are the people who sent you here, and they are telling you that you have lost your way. He looked directly at her, his gaze not of anger but of something approaching paternal disappointment. You are a young woman with immense talent. You have a platform that most of us in this chamber can only dream of. You have the ability to command the nation's attention. Imagine if all that energy, all that talent, all that influence was channeled not into fighting ideological battles and building a personal brand, but into the hard, unglamorous work of actual governance, into building coalitions, into forging compromises, into writing legislation that has a chance of becoming law, into delivering for the people who put their faith in you. He shook his head slowly. What a waste. He then stood up, a movement that drew the eyes of everyone in the room. Mr. Chairman, I thank the committee for its indulgence. I know I have gone on at some length, but I believed it was important for the American people to see the full picture, to understand the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. He looked one last time at Ocasio-Cortez, who sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She seemed smaller now, diminished. Congresswoman, I truly hope you will reflect on what has been discussed here today, not as a personal attack, but as an honest critique. Your constituents deserve a representative who measures success not in retweets, but in rental assistance, not in followers, but in families lifted out of poverty. They deserve better. With that, Kennedy turned and walked back to his seat on the dais. He sat down, opened a folder of unrelated legislative notes, and began to read, as if the last hour of political theater had been nothing more than a minor administrative task. now completed. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the thick, heavy silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. The chairman, looking relieved and slightly dazed, tapped his gavel. The chair will offer Representative Ocasio-Cortez an opportunity to respond. All eyes turned to her. Her staff behind her leaned forward, a silent, anxious chorus. This was the moment for the fiery rebuttal, the passionate defense, the call to arms that had defined her career. But it never came. She simply shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. What was there to say? To argue about the price of her car would seem petty. To defend her family's eviction notices would be a catastrophe. To debate the Amazon deal would be to relitigate a loss she had framed as a win. Every possible defense would only serve to reinforce the narrative Kennedy had so masterfully constructed. For the first time in her public life, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was speechless. Silence was the only option left. The chairman tapped his gavel again, this time with more force. "This hearing is adjourned." The words broke the spell. The room exploded into a cacophony of sound. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed, their strobing lights catching the stunned, vacant expression on AOC's face. Her aides immediately formed a protective circle around her, a human wall to shield her from the encroaching press corps. "No comment," one of them said, his voice strained. "No comment." They guided her quickly out of a side door, away from the cameras and the questions, into the private, anonymous corridors of the Capitol. Kennedy, meanwhile, gathered his materials with the same unhurried calm he had displayed throughout. Several of his Republican colleagues came over to slap him on the back, to shake his hand, their faces beaming with admiration. Even a few Democrats, as they filed out, gave him a quiet nod of respect. It was not an endorsement of his politics, but an acknowledgement of his skill. They were professionals recognizing the work of a master. Within the hour, the clips were everywhere. "Kennedy confronts AOC on family's eviction filings" was the headline that led every news site. By evening, the cable news channels had abandoned all other stories. Pundits dissected every moment, every question, every pained expression. Fact-checkers, scrambling to verify Kennedy's claims, found that every number, every date, every document he had cited was accurate. There was no spin to debunk. There were only the facts. The narrative that emerged was devastating. The progressive media tried to frame it as a cynical, personal attack, but the argument failed to gain traction. The evidence was too specific, the contradictions too stark. It was the eviction filings that proved to be the mortal wound. It was a story that was simple, brutal, and deeply personal. It transformed her from a righteous champion of the poor into just another hypocritical politician. The fall was not loud and explosive. It was quiet, complete, and utterly ruinous. In the days that followed, the political fallout was swift and merciless. The hearing was no longer just a news story. It had become a political crisis, a case study in reputational collapse. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the damage was immediate and profound. Her office released a long, multi-part statement, attempting to reframe the hearing as a partisan ambush and provide context for each of Kennedy's accusations. They explained the car was a lease to ensure security and reliability. They argued the apartment was necessary for the same reasons. They clarified that the family's property was a small-scale affair managed by her mother, and that eviction proceedings were a last resort after months of non-payment. But the explanations, however reasonable, were drowned out by the sheer force of the narrative Kennedy had created. In the court of public opinion, nuance is the first casualty. The story had been distilled into its most brutal elements: the luxury car, the expensive apartment, and the family who evicted tenants. Her attempts to pivot the conversation back to the larger issues of inequality were met with a new and widespread skepticism. A chorus of online comments from both the right and the left all carried the same theme: how can you lecture us about housing justice when your own family is filing eviction notices? The Democratic leadership, always pragmatic, began to quietly distance themselves. Invitations for AOC to appear as a surrogate for the party at major events dwindled. When asked about the hearing, senior Democrats would offer lukewarm defenses, saying things like, "I'm sure the Congresswoman has a perfectly good explanation," before quickly changing the subject. They recognized a politically toxic asset when they saw one. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded her, the sense that she was the untouchable voice of the future, was gone. She was now seen as vulnerable, flawed, and a potential liability to the party's more moderate members. More concretely, the hearing triggered a wave of official and semi-official inquiries. A conservative watchdog group filed a formal ethics complaint with the House, alleging misuse of the members' representational allowance for the purchase of the iPhone and the photo editing software, citing Kennedy's questioning as primary evidence. While the complaint was unlikely to result in serious disciplinary action, it guaranteed a new cycle of negative headlines and forced her office to spend time and resources on a legal defense. In New York, local news outlets began digging into the records of Deco Diaz LLC, uncovering more details about the eviction filings and interviewing former tenants, which kept the story alive in her own district. A primary challenger, a moderate city councilman who had been considering a run, saw his opportunity. He announced his campaign a week after the hearing, his message focused entirely on delivering real results for the Bronx, not just creating viral moments in Washington. For John Kennedy, the aftermath was a mirror image. His profile, already significant in conservative circles, exploded onto the national stage. He was hailed as a hero, a giant killer who had single-handedly exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the progressive movement. Fundraising for his own re-election campaign skyrocketed, with donations pouring in from all over the country. He was inundated with requests for interviews from every major news network. Characteristically, he turned most of them down. He had no interest in a victory lap. When he did speak, he was measured and sober, consistently downplaying his own role. "I just asked some questions that the American people had a right to have answered," he told one reporter. This wasn't about a personality conflict. It was about accountability. This refusal to gloat only enhanced his reputation, casting him as a serious statesman, a stark contrast to the performative outrage that defined so much of modern politics. His methods, however, were widely emulated. The Kennedy treatment became the new gold standard for Republican opposition research. Political operatives began shifting their focus from broad ideological attacks to the meticulous documentation of personal and financial hypocrisy. Other Republican members of Congress started showing up to hearings armed with their own binders, ready to grill witnesses on their expense reports, their travel records, and their public statements. The hearing had provided a new and devastatingly effective playbook for political combat. Perhaps the most significant consequence was the chilling effect it had on the progressive movement as a whole. The Green New Deal, already facing a steep uphill battle, was now politically radioactive. No moderate Democrat wanted to be associated with a plan that Kennedy had so effectively dissected as both fiscally impossible and sloppily drafted. The bill was quietly shelved, replaced by a series of smaller, more targeted climate initiatives. The broader progressive agenda, which had been gaining momentum within the Democratic Party, was suddenly on the defensive. The hearing had provided a powerful counter-narrative, one that painted progressive activists not as champions of the people, but as out-of-touch elites, living lives of privilege while prescribing austerity for everyone else. Weeks later, late one evening in his Senate office, Kennedy was reviewing agricultural subsidy legislation. A young aide knocked on the door. "Senator, the New York Times is doing a big follow-up piece on the Ocasio-Cortez hearing. They're calling it a paradigm shift in political discourse. They're asking for a comment on your strategy." Kennedy didn't look up from his papers. "Tell them my strategy was reading the public record. Tell them it's a strategy available to anyone with a library card. They're also asking if you feel it's fair to bring a member's family into a political debate," the aide pressed. Kennedy finally looked up, his expression serious. "I didn't bring her family into it. She did when she made their business the subject of her moral crusade. You can't declare war on an entire industry and then expect a personal exemption for your own relatives. That's not a strategy, that's just a simple fact." He gestured back to the papers on his desk. "Now, let's get back to work. These soybean farmers aren't going to help themselves." The aide nodded and left. Kennedy returned to his work, the unglamorous, tedious, and essential business of governing. The hearing was already in the past, a single successful battle in a much longer war. But for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the battle was far from over. She was still in Congress, still had her platform, still had millions of followers, but she was wounded. The foundation of her political identity, her authenticity, had been fractured. And in the brutal world of politics, a fracture, if not properly healed, can easily become a fatal break. The silence after the storm was not a sign of peace. It was the eerie calm in which everyone, friend and foe alike, waited to see if the structure would hold. In the months that followed, the political landscape subtly but irrevocably shifted. What became known simply as the hearing entered the lexicon of Washington, D.C., a shorthand for a moment of profound and brutal political accountability. It became a case study, required viewing in political science courses and campaign management seminars. Analysts dissected its every component, seeking to understand the alchemy that had made it so potent. First, there was the power of preparation. Kennedy had not simply shown up with a few talking points. He had arrived with a fortress of documentation, an unassailable case built brick by factual brick. He demonstrated that in an age of misinformation, the most powerful weapon is a well-researched, verifiable fact. He didn't offer opinions, he presented receipts. Second, the importance of tone. Kennedy never yelled, he never insulted, he never engaged in ad hominem attacks. His demeanor was one of relentless, almost surgical politeness. This disciplined approach made his critique all the more devastating. It denied his opponent the ability to claim victimhood, forcing her to confront the substance of his arguments rather than the style of his delivery. Third, the focus on actions over intentions. Kennedy repeatedly conceded that Ocasio-Cortez likely had good intentions. He didn't question her sincerity. He questioned her results. This shifted the debate from an unproductive argument about motivations to a substantive examination of effectiveness. It was a masterclass in holding a public official accountable not for what they believe, but for what they have actually accomplished. And finally, the devastating impact of hypocrisy. The hearing was a stark reminder of an ancient political truth. The public will forgive many things in a leader, but they will rarely forgive the perception that there is one set of rules for the powerful and another for everyone else. The contrast between the luxury car and the struggling constituent, the high-end apartment and the evicted tenant, was a narrative too powerful for any political spin to overcome. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the hearing marked an inflection point. She remained a formidable force in American politics, a powerful voice for the progressive cause. But something had been lost. The aura of untouchable authenticity was gone, replaced by a lingering cloud of doubt. Every future proposal she made, every impassioned speech she gave, would now be viewed through the lens of that hearing. The questions Kennedy had raised would linger in the public consciousness. Is this genuine? Is this authentic? Is she living the values she preaches? The wound to her political brand was not fatal, but it was permanent. For John Kennedy, the hearing solidified his reputation as one of the most effective and formidable figures in the Senate. The "aw shucks" country lawyer persona was now widely understood to be a brilliant piece of political camouflage, masking a razor-sharp intellect and a prosecutor's instinct for the kill. He had demonstrated that substance could still triumph over style, that a quiet man with a binder full of facts could be more powerful than the loudest voice on Twitter. But the true legacy of the hearing extends far beyond the careers of two politicians. It served as a powerful and necessary corrective in a political culture increasingly dominated by performance, celebrity, and ideological purity tests. It was a reminder that public service is, at its core, a service. It is not about building a brand, accumulating followers, or achieving viral fame. It is about the hard, often thankless work of improving the lives of the people you represent. It reminded us that accountability is not a partisan issue. It is a democratic necessity. All elected officials, regardless of their party or ideology, should be subject to the same rigorous scrutiny. Their words should be measured against their actions. Their promises should be compared with their results. Their public pronouncements should be held up against their private choices. Ultimately, the confrontation between John Kennedy and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a battle between two competing visions of politics. One vision sees politics as a platform for activism, a stage for moral drama, where the goal is to raise consciousness and inspire a movement. The other sees politics as the art of governance, a process of negotiation and compromise, where the goal is to achieve tangible, incremental progress. On that one afternoon, in a quiet Senate hearing room, the second vision won a decisive victory. The facts, meticulously gathered and calmly presented, proved to be more powerful than the most passionate rhetoric. It was a quiet, almost clinical demolition, but its effects will reverberate for years to come. It was a stark lesson that in the arena of public life, authenticity is not a costume you can put on. It is a reputation that must be earned day by day through consistency, honesty, and a willingness to live by the same standards you demand of others. The hearing was a painful but vital reminder that what we should demand from our leaders is not a perfect performance, but a simple, humble, and unwavering commitment to the truth. If you believe that our leaders need to be held accountable with facts, not just rhetoric, then please like this video and share it with others who feel the same. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the issues that truly matter.